Dr. Stephen Meyer is the author of Darwin's Doubt. He's also the author of Signature in the Cell. Let me go back to that earlier book, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, the Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year. I'm quite surprised. Why?
Well, it was a book of the year. I think they nominate more than one, but the person who nominated it was a philosopher of science from NYU, Thomas Nagel, who is actually an avowed atheist and says very openly and honestly that he does not want there to be such a person as God. And so just personally, he's sort of not inclined towards anything that would point in a theistic direction, but he's become very deeply skeptical about neo-Darwinism and about these theories of chemical evolution, which purport to explain how you get from the non-living chemicals in the prebiotic soup to the first living cell. And he wrote a very favorable review of the book in the Times Literary Supplement, and his nomination got it to the list, I guess. So,
intriguing, even though he does not want there to be a God.
Right. He came out. He took a huge amount of flack for endorsing the book, and they were running letters in the Times Literary Supplement for quite a while. But so we thought he probably had enough of the debate, and then 2 years later he came out with his own book called Mind and Cosmos: How the Neo-Darwinian View of Reality is Almost Certainly False. And his main point is that there is something else in the world besides chance, variation, and natural laws, but besides matter and energy. And that something else is mind. And we're aware of what minds do all the time. We have them. We see what kind of effects they have on nature. And any view of reality that can't account for the origin of the mind or excludes it from analysis of the world around us is just simply inadequate. And
I think one of the most important chapters in the book is chapter 19, The Rules of Science. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, I think so. And what I do in that chapter is I explain why many scientists have been reluctant to accept the case for intelligent design, despite what I and many of my colleagues regard as really overwhelming evidence for it. And that is because there's a rule. It's known as methodological naturalism. And it says this: if you're going to be a scientist, you have to limit yourself to materialistic explanations for everything. And that sounds pretty good because we're studying the material world in science. But the problem is there are certain types of phenomena that we know do not arise from undirected material processes. If you walk into the British Museum and you see all those beautiful inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone, you won't say, gee, isn't it wonderful what wind and erosion did? You'll recognize immediately that you're looking at the products of an intelligence. And we believe that what we're seeing inside life, inside living cells, and in particular in the information-bearing properties of DNA and other large information-bearing molecules, that we are seeing evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence. We literally have functional digital code there, which is running the show in the context of a hierarchically organized information processing system. It's just extraordinary.
Another way of approaching this from the total skeptic's point of view, from both sides of this ongoing debate, is that you can accept both theory, but you get back to the beginning of it, and it all, as far as I'm concerned anyway, it all comes down to faith. In whichever one you want to, we're going back to the very beginning of where it started and who designed the designer or whatever. It all depends on faith. Now, I recently read on this program a piece that you would have seen, of course, in the Wall Street Journal, and I forget who it was by, but it.
Oh, maybe the Eric Metaxas piece
about
the fine-tuning.
That's the piece.
Right.
Where so many different, you can put this better than I can, obviously, but so many different tangents, so many different inputs into the scenario depend each on the other. And if you pull one out, or if one moves by 1/1,000,000th of a point, the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, this is called the anthropic fine-tuning, and it's an additional evidence of design, not in life, but at the very foundation of the universe itself. It's the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, and it really is a way of understanding that the very fabric of the universe, in terms of its order and natural law, is exquisitely finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. We live in a kind of Goldilocks universe. And if I could go back to your earlier statement about faith, I think that's very interesting, because obviously these questions that arouse so much passion on both sides are scientific questions. They're questions about the origin and nature of life, the origin and nature of the universe, but they're also questions that have larger philosophical implications. And none of us were there and they're questions of origins. And none of us were actually there to see what happened. So in that sense, there's an element of faith in both views. But I would argue that the case for intelligent design and the broader theistic view is a more reasonable faith, because the kind of things that we're discovering in life and in the fine-tuning of the universe are things that we know from our ordinary experience. Our experience of cause and effect are things that arise only from the activity of an intelligence, of a designing mind, not from undirected material processes.
When we come back, I want your response to what Dawkins must think about his origins and whether or not he relies, even if he won't admit it, on faith.
Absolutely.
23 to 11, News Talk ZB. Do you believe that Dawkins himself, in spite of his enthusiasm, actually relies on faith for his beginnings?
Well, and a lot of secondhand knowledge. He's seen by the public as the great spokesman for science. He held that chair at Oxford and everything. But his position scientifically is extremely vulnerable, because his whole idea is that there's no evidence for God. God is a delusion because there's no evidence for design. And he says there's no evidence for design because the unguided, undirected process of natural selection and random mutation can produce the appearance of design without being designed or guided in any way. But yet you get into the evolutionary biology literature, the people that are doing the work in the field that he's popularizing, and they're saying very openly now that the mutation natural selection mechanism simply lacks the creative power to produce the major innovations in the history of life and the most striking appearances of design, like the digital code that we find in DNA.
If I go to the very back of the book, the last chapter before the responses to critics of the first edition is what's at stake. Now, I want to get onto the rules of science as well, but what is at stake here? What is this battle over?
Well, part of it's a battle over the rules of science and whether scientists will have the freedom to consider all possible explanations for living organisms, or whether they must confine themselves to strictly materialistic, undirected processes.
When you say materialistic, that's an economic term as well. So
right, exactly. I just mean
perspective for us.
I mean processes that are rooted only in matter and energy and which do not involve the activity of a conscious mind, of a rational intelligence. When you look at a living organism, there are two basic possibilities to explain its origin. Either it was the result of unguided, natural, or purely materialistic processes on the one hand, or a designing intelligence may have played a role. That's a logically possible causal explanation for the origin of life. And what the materialists want to do is say the rules of science forbid scientists from considering the second possibility. Well, if that's the case, then by default, the first possibility will be the only one that is ever considered. So part of what we're doing in the intelligent design research community is not only making a scientific argument for intelligent design, we're challenging the rules that prohibit scientists from considering what we regard as really compelling evidence for design: the digital code, the circuitry, the control systems, the hierarchically organized information processing
systems. And what
systems.
does Dawkins say to that?
Well, Dawkins says it's not science, and he simply repeats it with more and more vigor. But people who insist on that don't give a good argument. They simply want to take that as axiomatic, and we think that there is a good reason not to allow science to be proper or to be constrained in that way, because we think the fundamental obligation of the scientist is not to come up with materialistic explanations for everything, but rather to follow the evidence where it leads to the best explanation, the one that is most consistent with our knowledge of cause and effect and how it works in the world. And what we know about cause and effect is that it does take an intelligent mind to generate information.
What pushback do you get? How much?
A lot. A lot of it is, there is some argumentation, but a lot of it is the kind of exercise of cultural or sociological power within the scientific community. I was in a big part of a big controversy in 2004 where a leading evolutionary biologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who had the temerity to send an article I submitted out for peer review, was really viciously persecuted after the article was subsequently published. And there have been a number of cases of really extreme abridgment of academic freedom from really top scientists. This gentleman, Richard Sternberg, has 2 earned PhDs in evolutionary biology, and he was treated just absolutely horribly. They took away his office, his keys, his access to scientific samples.
Hang on, he objected to yours?
He neither objected nor affirmed. He was the editor who allowed an article that I had submitted to be published. And so he wasn't actually the thought criminal himself. He simply allowed a thought crime to be perpetrated.
All right. In the few minutes we've got left, the rules of science. This is an area that does intrigue me, because the rules of science have been and they continue to be corrupted, in my humble opinion. by some of the players in the game. Would you agree?
I do agree, because this rule that we're fighting, methodological naturalism, is actually a way of enshrining a materialistic interpretation of reality and imposing that on all forms of scientific investigation, even investigation of biological and cosmological origins, even investigations of human beings in the social and psychological sciences. If you have to explain all human behavior by reference to chance and necessity, or by some form of determinism, biological or environmental determinism, you might miss something really important, like the role of the human mind in making choices. So, and there are other scientific debates where ideology ends up establishing the parameters of investigation, and when that happens, it has a corrupting influence on science. It keeps science from getting to the truth because it limits the thinking of the scientists, either by the granting process or by these formal rules of method that we're encountering. So the public tends to give science a great deal of respect as well. We all should. It's a great institution, but it can be corrupted by ideological agendas, and that's something we have to guard against.
Most people think of scientists as people without an agenda. The rules of science. It's one of the final chapters in the book. What are the rules of science?
Well, it depends on the discipline, but in the discussion of biological and cosmological origins, the rule has been you must explain everything by reference to matter and energy, or chance and necessity, purely materialistic processes. And again, the problem with that is there are many things that we know do not arise that way. If you look at a complex integrated circuit, or if you look at a message or a text, if you look at a piece of nanotechnology, we know from experience that those things always arise as the result of conscious and rational activity, as a result of agency or intelligence. So the problem with that rule in our area of discourse is that it forces scientists to one type of conclusion, whereas the evidence may be pointing in another direction. But there are other debates and other branches of science that also have limiting rules. And we think the fundamental rule of science should be to follow the evidence where it most naturally and most logically leads, not to some predetermined conclusion that may be determined either by a methodological rule or by a sociological convention or even by a consensus or an alleged consensus in a particular field.
It's the consensus aspect of science that really gets under my skin.
As well it should, because science should be driven by evidence, and many a consensus that you find in various disciplines of science is not driven by consensus, but it's often driven by the perception that all smart people agree. So you get this kind of house of cards thing where everyone is agreeing because they think everyone else is agreeing, and people have lost track of what the actual evidence is. And getting back to the evidence, I think, is crucial.
How much self-censorship is there in the science faculties?
Well, I can't speak for all debates, but in the debate about Darwinism and intelligent design, there's a huge amount of self-censorship. We very actively cultivate a network of scientists around the world, and grad students and PhD students and postdocs. And I can tell you, there's a huge amount of dissenting opinion from the alleged consensus as portrayed to the public by people like Dawkins. Richard Dawkins. And there's just a lot of scientists who know it's not safe to be openly skeptical about this, so they self-censor.
If we take 100% as total scientific knowledge, where are we at overall?
On this issue?
No, on any issue. On science, period, about what might be available to us.
I don't know. I can really speculate on that. I think what we have typically found is that nature continues to surprise us.
Great pleasure having you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about your speech your address next Monday after 11.
This is News Talk ZB.